Let's get ready 30 seconds early. My name is Tanya Sanchez, and I'm presenting today on anxiety and learning. Oh, you know what I did not ask is how do I change slides? Let's see. Found it. Okay, great. Okay, so today was on anxiety and learning. I do want to start by saying that Adobe did send me an email that when you logged on, you may possibly get a virus. So they're going to update me and see what's going on in terms of how we can fix it. So I don't want you to fret. I don't want you to worry. But we'll just continue. And if you have any other questions, let me know. Okay? And you will see that there's a chat button on your right where you can ask me questions. So I'm Tanya Sanchez. I've been a speech language pathologist for 21 years. I am also a teacher of the speech and language impaired for 21 years in New York City and in Florida. I started back when ABA was relatively new. Following subsequently working with children on the spectrum, I decided to go back and become a board certified behavior analyst. And the idea was that it really enriched my practice as an SLP. Once you become a behavior analyst, it does change the way you work. And I have a Florida Educational Leadership Certificate. So more importantly, I think for this topic and why I deem it important is I'm the mother of 2 children with disabilities in mainstream school. In 1st grade, my son was diagnosed with ADHD and anxiety disorder, and he was recommended for medication. Oh, I just got some information on Adobe. Does anybody want information in regards to the let me get you in regards to the virus? Actually, it was a hoax. There is no virus. What I was trying to do is kind of incite a little bit of anxiety and then present you with a lot of information about myself and see how much you retained. So if I went back and I asked you if you could name 3 certifications that I have, how many of you would be able to do so? Were you really listening to me, or were you wondering, oh my gosh, what am I going to do when I finish this? Is my computer going to crash? You know, what's going to happen to all my work? Were you thinking about what was going to happen if you did have a virus, or were you paying attention to me? And that's really at the crux of what I'm going to talk to you about for the next hour, is that a lot of our kids are in a state of anxiety. And the idea that we are trying to have them learn things is counterproductive if we don't deal with that state of anxiety. So a little bit more about why this subject is near and dear to me is that, again, I'm the mother of 2 children. In the 1st grade, my son was diagnosed with ADHD and anxiety disorder and recommended, as is customary, medication. In 2nd grade, my daughter still couldn't read, diagnosed dyslexic, and started having full-blown panic attacks at 3 years of age after a major trauma, which was a divorce. In 2013, both of my children were recommended for retention. Beyond my own children, I've started to think about all my students, and not only all my students, but even a lot of the people that I work with. And the more you read, the more you look around, millennials are the most stressed generation. And now Generation Y, which is the generation after them, is also, they have statistically, they are the most anxious generation. And when I think about my students, I think what's going to happen to them, to the next generation. Right now, 80% of children with ASD have anxiety. Parents report that is more debilitating than the actual ASD. So, what is anxiety? Anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety comes in many different forms, such as panic attacks, phobia, social anxiety. And the distinction between an official diagnosis and normal anxiety isn't always clear. A lot of our children don't have official diagnosis of anxiety, but once you stop and you really start to think about their behavior, you can see the correlation. Anxiety affects our whole being. It affects how we feel, how we behave, and it has very real physical symptoms. It feels a bit like fear, but whereas we may know what we are frightened of, we often don't know what we are anxious about. And I think this is true of adults. We really don't have the skills to recognize when we're anxious, and also the permission to say that we're anxious and to deal with it. Causes of anxiety. There are problems in the functioning of brain circuits that regulate fear and other emotions. Studies have shown that severe or long-lasting stress can change the way nerve cells transmit information from one region of the brain to another. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happens in the brain when you're anxious. This prolonged exposure to long-lasting stress can change certain brain structures that control memories linked with strong emotions. Anxiety disorders tend to run in families. There are certain environmental factors, such as trauma or significant event, that may trigger an anxiety disorder in people who are susceptible to developing the disorder. So in my case, anxiety tends to run in my family. So my daughter, who was very young at 3, had a major trauma that triggered this susceptibility. Our children with ASD have significant sensory processing disorders and can make the world a very stressful place. Now, anxiety has a function. We should feel anxious in certain situations, in certain settings, in certain environments. If I'm walking down a dark alleyway, I should be a little anxious because I'm going to be a little hypervigilant, make sure there's nobody lurking in the dark. But anxiety is often triggered by stress. Anxiety is normal in stressful situations. And again, it can even be helpful. When I'm in that dark alley, my senses should be hypervigilant because I want to make sure nothing's going to come out and try to get me. For example, most people will be anxious when threatened by an aggressive person. This stress triggers a response similar to fear. The burst of adrenaline and nerve impulses, which we have in response to stressful situations, can encourage a fight or flight response. And this response is very important. It's going to be at the basis of our discussion, because I think a lot of our children with ASD are constantly responding in this manner. So back in the day, when we had saber-toothed tigers, this response was very important. When we saw something that was dangerous to us, that could risk our survival, we fled, as we should have. But our situation these days is not the same. We're not dealing with situations that can risk our survival constantly. So, when is anxiety a problem? When it's out of proportion to the stressful situation. When the person is reacting to a situation that is not noxious in a noxious response. When the anxiety persists when a stressful situation has gone or the stress is minor. When it appears for no apparent reason, when there is no stressful situation. A lot of our children, these responses can be cumulative, and we may not see, we may not be able to attach it to one situation or one antecedent where the child starts to melt down. So we see that that constant exposure to the stress can all of a sudden trigger something. It's not exactly consistent. Anxiety disorders affect millions of adult Americans. And most anxiety begins in childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. So let's talk a little bit about the brain, because this, I think, is fundamental for us to understand in our children and in ourselves. So there's three parts of the brain we're going to talk about. The cerebellum, this is really, your brainstem. This is what controls, you're not in control of it. It controls your breathing, your heartbeat, your motor skills. And then the limbic system, which we call the emotion system, it's your reactionary part of your system. It has that fight or flight response. It is linked to your survival. The main reason it exists is to keep you alive. And then you have your cerebral cortex up here in the front, and that's your thinking brain. Now, I call the limbic system the downstairs brain and the cerebral cortex the upstairs brain. And actually, that was a term, we'll talk about the author later. So, the brain. The prefrontal cortex is the most evolved part of the brain region. It controls our higher order thinking, our cognitive abilities, our logic. And it is also the brain region that is most sensitive to the detrimental effects of stress. The hippocampus is called the memory keeper. It regulates our memories and emotion. It attaches emotions to memories. And then we have the amygdala, and it's the bodyguard. This is the part of the brain that detects danger. It produces stress, fear, and anxiety to protect us. So when I'm in that dark alley, my amygdala is the one that's going to tell me to run or fight. So let's talk about how we receive stimuli. An event happens, and that's the stimuli. And this, again, is very basic. It's not a neurology course, nor am I a neurologist. But for me, it was very important to understand what's going on in our children's brains, that it's something linked to something that they can't control. And it was my job to help them control it. So here comes the event. The event happens, it's the stimuli. The amygdala says, is it okay? Or it's not okay. And it gets that information from the hippocampus, because that hippocampus is controlling our memories. So the amygdala say, hey, there's a saber-toothed tiger. The hippocampus says, your cousin got eaten by one of those. So the amygdala says, let's run. Now, if the amygdala says it's okay, it sends the information to the conscious mind, which is your prefrontal cortex, the logic. Okay, that loop is very important, because if it's not okay, that information never gets to your prefrontal cortex. The amygdala steps in and takes over to protect you. So, upstairs, downstairs brain. Survival mode is when you're in that flight, fight, or freeze. Okay, so the amygdala hijack is when the amygdala says, oh, the hippocampus says that's not okay. We have to get out of here. This is dangerous. This is going to hurt me. This is going to risk my survival. And it shuts off the learning and thinking, and it reacts. So if we think about children who have trauma, or children who are sensory processing disorders, they're working in this space a lot, because if you interpret loud noises or certain touch as noxious, your amygdala is going to say, this is not okay, and try to protect you. Amygdala hijack. So this is a term coined by Daniel Goleman in his 1996 book, Emotional Intelligence. When the amygdala is calm, other parts of the brain can take the helm, like the PFC, which is associated, again, with those higher order brain functions. These are the brain functions that we need to learn. They control self-awareness, concentration, decision making. When the amygdala hijacks the brain, the amygdala takes over the cerebrum, the thinking part. There's little or no ability to rely on intelligence or reasoning. The immediate result of a hijack is a decrease in working memory. Is everybody okay? Everybody with me so far? Any questions? Let me know. I want to make sure everybody understands, and that's the neurotypical brain. That's everybody's brain, from a little child to an adult. That's how that process works. So now let's talk a little bit about the ASD brain. And this is by Brenda Smith-Miles, who presented at CARD conference last year. So she talks about in the ASD brain, there's underactivity in the self-regulation parts of the brain. We all, if we work with children on the spectrum, know that. The PFC, as we said, is the executive for the decision-making in the brain, is less active in people with ASD during emotional regulation. Now, it's less active in everybody in terms of anxiety, but in any emotional need to regulate, the PFC is less active in people with ASD. So I ask myself, and I ask you to ask yourself, can we make the best choices when our PFC is impaired, when we are anxious or scared? And for children on the spectrum, if we think again, we go back to that sensory processing disorder, how much are they interpreting as something that should make them anxious or scared? So the amygdala in the ASD brain is related to eye contact and emotion recognition for all of us. But in the ASD brain, it grows in size more quickly, but yet it's underactive. In everybody, this part of the brain is not fully developed until 18 years of age. Now, we also see issues in the ASD brain with integration. There is less and different integration across brain regions, and there is difficulty with implicit learning. So another question I always ask myself with my students is, I don't assume they should know something because I know or because I think they should know. And this goes from, if I assume the child should know, he should ask, or if I assume the child should know how to escape a situation appropriately, I just never assume. I use it as a teaching situation to help them. So, oh, my little graphics didn't come out. But so working memory is the system responsible for the transient holding and processing of new and already stored information. So there should be a little arrow going up here for anxiety and a little arrow going down for working memory. The relation is, as anxiety increases, working memory goes down. And this is for everybody, not just children with ASD. We cannot access the working memory when we're in a state of anxiety. We need to access strategies to regulate. So when we tell the child, can you just calm down, and they're in a full meltdown, not going through. Everybody can lose 13 to 20 IQ points when they're anxious. Our learning is disabled. We cannot learn and retain info. We cannot access what we do know. So when you're in an argument with somebody and you know that, okay, I should breathe, I should calm down, but if you're really anxious about what's going on, you're not thinking about those coping strategies that you know you should be able to do. Same thing with our children and our students. Oh, there it is. As anxiety goes up, working memory goes down for every brain. So let's talk a little bit about sensory and the ASD brain. Brains of children with ASD are 40% more active. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen the pictures of the pruning and how the ASD brain doesn't prune as well as a neurotypical brain. Brain regions that process emotions react more to noise. they have they are hyper-responsive to mildly aversive tactile and auditory stimuli, especially when presented together. Just yesterday, I had discussion with one of my teachers here, and we have 6 kids in the class, and she was saying that they were just all triggering each other because of the loud noises each one was making. And my recommendation was, well, you have a lot of outside space. Why don't we just take them all one-on-one and work in an outside quiet area? It's going to change the way their brain is reacting to what they're learning in front of them. Children with ASD can experience tactile and auditory stimuli as pain. If they are hyper-responsive, their brain can interpret it as pain. And we all know we all want to avoid or escape any pain stimuli. There is a neurotransmitter called GABA, and this enables the brain to process pieces of information rather than the gestalt, rather than all at once. They found that this neurotransmitter is reduced in brains with ASD. We see that our children can only see details, not the overall gestalt. And we see that a lot of them become quite perceptive on those details. They process small changes similar as if they were a major change or trauma. And we see this in some of our children who, a simple thing like a schedule change or a room change can really put them into a full meltdown because they don't expect it. Other characteristics in ASD that can affect anxiety. We all know that a lot of them can have low tone, poor body awareness, motor planning disorders, and of course, a lot of them are nonverbal. And if you don't have a team that's focusing on functional communication training, it's very difficult to be in a world where you don't have the ability to communicate and control what's going on. So if you cannot control your body, imagine how much more threatening the world seems. Also, if you don't have a way to communicate with the environment and let people know what your needs and wants are, imagine how much more frustrating the world seems. So these are some statistics regarding ASD and anxiety. It can affect up to 80% of youth with ASD, and it can present itself in different manners. We have general anxiety disorder, which is disabling worry. We have separation anxiety disorder, which is intense fear or separating from caregivers. We can have obsessive compulsive disorder, which is those intrusive thoughts and rituals. And social phobia, which is fear of humiliation and avoidance of specific social rituals. And we can see the numbers are quite high for our children with ASD, all in their 30s, 30%. Okay, so ADHD is the #1 misdiagnosis of anxiety. So in the case of my son, I think that was the exact case. He did not have ADHD. He had an anxiety disorder. And in the 2nd grade, it presented itself in very odd tics. So at one point, because 2nd grade was so stressful for him and was so inducing of anxiety, he used to kiss everything. It was the oddest behavior, but before he gave things to me, he would pick it up and kiss it. He would say, okay, Mommy, so I went to the store today and I wanted to go do my homework, and he had no idea he was doing it. He could not control it. When I brought it to his attention, he looked at me like I had 2 heads. And it was definitely heartbreaking to see in such a young child. Of course, consequently, I removed him from that school and we started a different school. And he's now in 7th grade in a mainstream school and doing okay, trying our best. But anxiety is the 2nd most highly cited problem behavior reported by parents of children with ASD. It's, and as we'll see, things that we could do to help them. But the anxiety part of it begins to interfere with daily routines with life more than the ASD itself. So as a therapist, as a teacher, as a parent, what can we look for? What can we look for signs to see that maybe our child is expressing or experiencing anxiety? And there is a citation at the end here, and I also provide you with a list of citations at the end of the presentation that you can look up yourself, some wonderful articles and people and professionals in the field. So, okay, excessive worry. And this is worrying too much about everyday things. It's persistent, and it must interfere with daily life. The distinction between an anxiety disorder and having normal anxiety is that it really does interfere with everyday life, and it causes a lot of suffering. And when I think of my students, I always think of when they ask the same question over and over again. They're excessively worrying about what's coming next or what's happening next. I'm just trying to see, it's going to fade. Okay, so what happens is they're anxious. So they may ask the question, you answer them, and remember, their working memory is decreased. They forget. The thought pops up in their head. And we'll talk about this again in a little bit in terms of how we can help them. But this is definitely something I see in a lot of my students. Irrational fears. Some anxiety isn't generalized at all. It's specific. And the fear can become overwhelming, disruptive, and again, way out of proportion. This I see in the children who have fear of certain sounds or certain visual stimuli or certain tactile, and things like fear of the toilet bowl when it flushes, fear of the vacuums, where the kid doesn't even want to go into the bathroom, and potty training is an issue. Muscle tension. So this is near constant muscle tension. This can definitely present itself during anxiety, and we can see they can be clenching their jaws, balling their fist. I think of my students, I have a lot who teeth grind. They grind their teeth constantly. Hypervigilance, another one I see in a lot of my students. So this is an enhanced state of sensitivity to the environment to detect threat. For me, I equate it to learning happens right here, and hypervigilance happens all around here. So if the child is hypervigilant and constantly attending to what's going on around them, there's no way they're going to learn to what's in front of them, because the brain is just thinking about what's that sound, who's coming in the door. It's definitely takes a lot of their energy and attention to pay attention to the external environment as opposed to what's on the table in front of them. Children with ASD have difficulty predicting other people's behavior, which makes hypervigilance productive because they don't know what we're going to do. They assume threat. And an emotional memory or trauma can trigger hypervigilance. It is definitely downstairs brain. Again, children cannot focus on what's in front of them if they're always focused on what's around them. This hypervigilance definitely looks like ADHD. Not that the child can't focus, it's that the brain is choosing to focus on everything around them because it's protective. And one more thing about hypervigilance, like I have a child who can tell a therapist if they've changed their nail polish color. She'll notice if I wear different shoes. Definitely hypervigilant for someone to notice these little specific things in the environment. So another thing that we can look for is chronic ingestion. A lot of our kids have digestive issues, and a lot of it can definitely be linked to anxiety in the digestive tract. That's how their system is incorporating or coping with the anxiety. Panic. So a full-blown panic attack can be terrifying. I'm not sure how many of you have witnessed them. And sometimes I think some of the meltdowns that we see in our children with ASD can, if we knew, if we were able, children were able to tell us more about what they felt, would probably be somewhat panic attacks. It may look like a meltdown. It's definitely the child is out of control. It's not something they can control. They'll start breathing heavy, the heart starts racing, their hands go numb, sweating, dizziness. They really just want to, I've had panic attacks. I just want to run out of the room screaming for fear. And my daughter has full-blown panic attacks, and they are terrifying. The great thing is because I've had them very much able to help her, I say, talk her down and help her cope with it. Self-consciousness. The anxiety is provoked by everyday situations, such as show and tell. For me, I equate this to a lot of our children don't like to be publicly praised or that loud praise, you know, when they hear everybody go, yay! It's definitely overstimulating because of the loudness of the praise, but it's much more effective if you kind of praise them much more quietly. It doesn't trigger that response. Perfectionism. We see a lot of this in our children. This is that what we call that OCD behavior where they want everything in place. They want to line things up. They want to put things on the table. Everything has to be just so. And one thing about this behavior, I think is their way of coping because everything in place makes us feel better. I don't know how many of you, when you have something that creates anxiety in you, start cleaning. You get home and you start cleaning your house. And what it is you're trying to ascertain some kind of control in your life. It's a coping strategy for you. I can't control what happened to me. It's definitely anxiety, creating anxiety. But if I can clean my house and keep everything in perfect order, then I feel more in control. And these are what our kids are doing. Glass and Singer, in a 1971 study, quite a long time ago, the year I was born, they showed that when we feel in control of a situation, same situation, we are not as impaired. Whereas those who feel out of control, even the same situation, definitely had more significant impairment in using their logical brain, in working memory, in IQ. So that making people feel in control, making our students feel in control, is something that we can use. Compulsive behaviors. The need to complete things, rituals. So I tell people, if you like your radio at volume level 3 and it breaks and it gets stuck on 4, would you be in a total panic until you could get it fixed? Some of you would say no, because that doesn't matter to you. But this morning, I couldn't find my coffee cup. And that's my coffee cup. I looked high and low. I couldn't find it. So I had to go to Starbucks, because if I couldn't have my coffee cup, I would not drink coffee unless it was Starbucks, because I had a presentation to do. So if we really stop and look at ourselves, we all have compulsive behaviors. In our children, we see these increase when they're trying to calm themselves. Repetitive behaviors are calming. It's their coping strategy when they don't know anything else, when we haven't taught them other more appropriate ways. So less obvious signs of anxiety in our students, being angry, being irritable, inflexible, overreactive, difficulty completing work. Rock Brain is a program. He comes from a program that we do with some of our children, and it's that Rock Brain, that inability to be flexible we see. So what I want you to remember from this part is that anxiety-driven behavior is unpredictable. We can't pinpoint when children will melt down, and it can be cumulative. So the anxiety cycle. So the children, there's an anxious trigger. Triggers fear and anxiety. They start to do some compulsive or safety behavior, some OCD behavior, things that we may deem inappropriate, odd, undesirable behaviors, but it makes their anxiety go away. It has a function. It helps them escape from the behavior. It functions as a negative reinforcement. They have a reduction in distress, and then it starts all over again. So these may be behaviors we don't want them to participate in, but they have a function, and we need to help them learn new appropriate behaviors to reduce that distress. That is the most important part here. So I've had some therapists tell me, well, how do we know when they're just not having a temper tantrum? They're just not trying to be difficult. And this is a kind of little cheat sheet to help you guys understand when it's a temper tantrum versus the meltdown. There's actually a great video, and my PowerPoint, I wanted to put it in, but I wasn't sure how it would work. But it's a video of about a 2-year-old, and he's having a temper tantrum. He's on the floor screaming, and mom leaves the room. And every time she leaves the room, he stops crying, stands up, goes to where she is, starts crying, flops on the floor, screaming. She gets up, she leaves the room. He proceeds to stop, remove himself from there, go find her, and start screaming. So we see that the child is in control. The child will look to see if the behavior is getting a reaction. They usually don't hurt themselves. And there's a goal. They want if it's for attention, they're looking for that attention. So in that video, the child was looking for the attention. When the attention was taken away, he had enough control to get up, find mom, and continue with his temper tantrum. The meltdown, very different. The child is not in control. It is lower brain. There's no concern for his own safety or others. There's no involvement in a social situation. They don't care about others' reaction to his behaviors. It is not manipulative. An emotional regulatory response to self-protect. It is subcortical. It's lower brain. They're not doing it because they're trying to get a rise out of you. They're doing it because whatever's going on, whatever situation or trigger has triggered their anxiety, has triggered their lower brain. They're in an amygdala hijack. And I think this is very important because as the teacher or the therapist working or the parent on the other side, we need to help that child. We have to change our behaviors as well as our students. We can only control our behaviors, and through controlling our behaviors, we can help them change their behaviors. How do we do this? Support, respect, and partnership. Our role. I think it's important that we understand the uncertainty they feel, that we respond with compassion, that we express appreciation. A lot of times I'll tell them, I know this is hard for you. I know, this is upsetting for you, and provide support. We help the child develop self-regulatory skills. A big thing that I do is I use mutual regulation. So I'll use my own demeanor, my own body to help them self-regulate. If we start to, I know there's a lot of people will talk about desensitization, presenting the child to the stimuli to desensitize them. I like to use the word normalize because we never want to, anxiety it has a function. We want the child to feel anxiety in certain situations. It is for survival. But we want them to normalize their reaction to certain sensory stimuli, to certain triggers. And we have to do it in such a way that it is nurturing and compassionate, because then we teach the brain, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. And then eventually that constant linking of you're exposed to this, it's okay, I'm here, we'll work through it, will help them learn coping strategies. So misbehavior is a symptom of an underlying cause. We have to change the way we think about what the child's doing. It's not that the child can't. I'm sorry, it's not that the child won't, it's that the child can't. Behavior is communication. Behavior has a function, and behavior occurs in patterns. The only behavior we can control is our own. So I constantly try to change my own behavior so that I can help the child change theirs. Jessica Minahan has some wonderful stuff on her website, in her books, in articles. She presented at the last two CARD conferences, and she's actually coming back to South Florida. Wonderful person to read a lot of her papers and her books. She calls it FAIR. She does a functional assessment. She provides accommodations. And this is the biggest thing that I like, interaction strategies. She talks about in her assessments how to interact with that specific child in certain ways, even as much as you can present something and step back, give the child space to deal with what you've just presented, which is very important because each child is different. And then responses. And this is something you can look more into if you're definitely interested. So how can I help? How can you help? How can we help our students? First and foremost, prevention. I think prevention is worth its weight in gold. You can use these as much as necessary to reduce anxiety triggers and to teach coping strategies. So how can we do that? Offer choices. Functional communication training, promote independence, develop manding skills, reduce excessive requesting and protesting, and try to reduce us saying no to them. A good thing is to teach them to ask when instead of can. When can I have that? When can I go out? Everybody should know the 5-point rating scale. So we have, let's say this child, Isaac, we presented him, if he doesn't read, then we could use just faces as opposed to what they need to do in terms of the emotional state that they're approaching. And what we want them to do is recognize when they're starting to approach that 2 or 3 and what they need to do to help themselves cope. And the good thing about the 5-point rating scale, it can really be adapted to any situation, any child, and it is definitely individualized. Special interest or activities. I know there could be some controversy because some people feel that the children will become somewhat perseverative on these special interests. I tend to think, or I've seen that it can be soothing to the child. So if there's something that is of their special interests or activities, you can provide them access to that. You can make a photo album of it, things that will calm them, will help them. I have a child that we have like a little picture of mom, and he carries the picture of mom in his pocket, or we leave it on the table. You can provide a home base or a cool zone, and this is for them to be able to ask to escape appropriately. We all escape when we go to the bathroom, when we say, oh, I'm going to go send an email. We all escape a situation. It's definitely an appropriate response, and they need to learn how to escape appropriately without having somebody say, no, you can't escape. It's better off the child escapes the situation, pulls himself together, and comes back. So they have even suggestions that maybe the child does better in a separate room, so they can take their work with them and do the work in that room. If they need to escape a certain, say, the other children in the room, or if it's loud, or wherever it may be. We also have like quiet tents in our school, little areas where the children can go and just sit there quietly. We have to think about, Barry Prezant just wrote a book, and it's actually wonderful, and I do recommend it a lot. He talks about certain triggers that we may not think about. That unstructured time for a lot of our kids can trigger anxiety, transitions, social demands, novel or unexpected change. I work with a child that if we change something on him, I absolutely, I absolutely blame us when he melts down because we did not give him we did not preview with him the changes that will happen. We broke the rules, and that's one thing I always tell to people that I work with or training. Uh, did we break a rule? And if we broke a rule, whose fault is it if the child starts to melt down? So when we talked about that excessive worrying, when we see those children who constantly ask the same question, what we've seen is that ignoring those, some people tell you, well, answer them one, then ignore the rest of it. What we see is that it starts to increase their anxiety and it starts to increase more non-desirable behavior. They'll ramp it up more and more. So just prevent it. It's coming from a place of anxiety. It's coming from lower brainstem, the lower brain. You have to remember they're having trouble with that long-term memory. They ask a question, you answer, but they're not retaining what you said. And then the question pops up in their head again because they're excessively worrying about it. So just write it down. Write it down, have a picture for them. Visuals will help them. It will help them become more independent so they can calm their anxiety. And I mean, I don't know how many of you use a day runner or a schedule, but if I don't have my schedule in front of me or my day runner, I'm a hot mess. I don't know where I'm going next or what I'm supposed to be doing. Priming, another thing we should be doing with our kids, which is reviewing or rehearsing any changes beforehand. It prepares the student. I will, again, this child, if he's used to coming to this room at this time and we change it on him, heaven help us. I blame us because we broke the rule that this is what we've taught him to do. And especially I find this for the nonverbal children, this is definitely an issue because they don't have the means to tell us, to ask us what's going on. They don't understand. So definitely take the time to provide review or rehearse with them so that they can process the transition. They really just want to know what's going on. Increase predictability. Don't assume they know what's next. Remember, the children with ASD have difficulty predicting other people's behavior. So help them understand and help them with predictability by, as we all use visual schedules, on there, if they have AAC, put it on their AAC, on the iPad or whatever device they're using. Practice, practice. So this is a quote for me, I think, that's important. When someone is going through a storm, your silent presence is more powerful than a million words. Sometimes when they're melting down, just being there with them and providing a presence is more powerful than trying to interact with them too much, because as we see, sometimes that tactile stimuli can be more aversive. So this leads us into connection and interaction. As I said, try not to put your hands on them when they're in that meltdown. That tactile stimulation can be more aversive and in fact aggravate the situation. So try to minimize the sensory stimuli, slow down life, provide a lot of free reinforcement. Try to increase their feelings of safety. Just by you being there, it could help them connect with them. I, again, try to do it. I'll just say, I know this is hard for you. When you're ready, I'm here. Support me in silence. Support me with your presence. So I think this is a great quote for a lot of our students. When you plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it is not doing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun. You never blame the lettuce. Yet, if we have problems, we blame the other person. But if we know how to take care of them, they will grow well, like the lettuce. No blame, no reasoning, no argument, just understanding. If you understand and you show that you understand, you can love and the situation will change. I have too many times gone into observe or supervise, and the therapist will tell me, well, they're just not complying or they're just not behaving. And we very often point the fingers at our students, when reality is we should point the fingers at ourselves and see what we can do to help the children flourish. So these are the works cited, and these are other resources that I think might be helpful to you guys. There are some websites here. We've used MindUp and a lot of work from Dan Siegel and Jessica Minahan. And again,